Let's move on to our next speaker, Ashan Fernando from 99X. He's the founder of Endlier, a startup on content creation that works with over 40 software professionals across the country, helping international brands for content strategy and execution. Let's gear up to hear from Ashan on how AWS shapes the role of a software architect in year 2021. Ashan, all yours.
Um, uh, Thanks for the broad introduction. So let me share my screen.
Sure.
Okay, so can you all see my screen?
Yeah, yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so let me start with the session. So a bit about me. I guess I got a very good introduction. So I've been working as a solution architect as 9x, a software services company, and then I've been working on different types of software domains, like working with products in travel, healthcare, accounting, aviation, and etc. And also, this gave me kind of quite a deep understanding about how different products works and how the architects involved in designing the products, especially in with the cloud. And also, I've been an active member on the AWS Community Builder program. Also, like doing open source Google Sum of Code mentor. So there are a few activities where I got involved. And one of the core contributions is for the serverless DynamoDB local plugin, which has more than 100,000 downloads per month. So that's basically about me. Moving into this session, as software architects, we usually follow a process, right? Like that's quite common. And when developing software products, which I'm quite familiar with, and of course there are architects who are from the enterprise background, which is slightly different, but more or less follows the same approach, where we start with the functional and non-functional requirements. Then identifying these the important requirements that has the kind of, we call them the quality attributes. After that, we try to figure out like what's quite important, find the trade-off like in terms of security, availability, and then finally come up with the architecture runway, where we next do the technical selection. And this process is quite firm, and ultimately for external party, they will see that these architects might ultimately kind of responsible in terms of the frameworks, code, and the technology that they select upon. And so this is kind of the early days before cloud. And those days, the hardware was not much of a problem for us because the infrastructure was quite managed by the IT team. And that was a kind of a good era where like we can keep our core focus in terms of how we structure our software, how we structure our program, and so on. But then with the move to the cloud, so I'm just recalling back 8-10 years ago, then we, like when we moved to the cloud, we got the opportunity to have more power in our hand. Like we have the more options in terms of our services that we choose, more middleware support. Then also like we can design applications with different kind of quality attributes, with even keeping the cost low. So we have more options, and these options also came up with a lot of power, and that actually increased our responsibility, where as architects we had to go beyond the code and frameworks and start thinking about the infrastructure, the middleware, and also DevOps. And not saying that, I mean, the cost of ownership also had a very high focus, because all before the cloud era, we just had to kind of design the requirements for the infrastructure and then hand it over to the IT team, where they will take care of it. But now we have to start thinking about the cost in terms of selecting services and so on. And also some of the new paradigms starts to appear, like serverless, where our focus also went into choosing these services properly in terms of our architecture. Then if you look back about 5-6 years ago, we have seen that a new role emerge, which is we call it a cloud solution architect. And you can also see the cloud certification and all around this role, where one side of the people who's coming from the IT background also wanted to get into this role where they started covering the cloud technologies and then became cloud solution architects. And also on the other end, which is kind of from my end, where we used to be software developers, where we also wanted to build our expertise on cloud and then gradually became cloud solution architects. But on both sides, there's like a clear, I mean, this role clearly bridges the gap between the software architecture and also the infrastructure, where we had the leverage of designing the overall solution architecture. And some of you might wonder which side is better. And in fact, I could actually take an example to tell, like either coming from either the background to become a cloud solution architect is quite fine. Where I could take example, for example, like about 4 years ago, I used to work as a cloud solution consultant to a kind of a lift and shift project for a large airline reservation system. In that project, though I'm quite coming from the software background, I hardly had time to see and look into the software architecture because there was so much things moving so many moving parts where I could spend more time in terms of designing the overall architecture, the selection of the cloud services, designing for scale. So those things really mattered at that level, rather going into what's happening inside software. So even for me, though I'm coming from a software architecture background, when designing or kind of moving an application to the cloud, the nitty-gritties of the software at that level isn't required. Like I could still work with kind of considering this application as black boxes. So that's why I mentioned like coming from either the background is fine. But there was one thing like, so this is not the same today. Like if you work on a lift and shift, this could be still fine. But if you are working today, things have changed quite a lot. And from those days to now, year on year, it became quite difficult to draw the line between cloud and code. Because I guess most of you have agreed with me. If I tell like today, we are talking about cloud native and also leveraging these services in cloud like Lambda, API gateways, also part of our application code and part of our solution. So it's very difficult to draw this line, like which part is the infrastructure, which part is the code. So then fast forward to today in 2021, as software architects, it demands quite a lot of skill set, a kind of a broad skill set to adapt to the modern development, because the cloud is simply not about the infrastructure anymore. And for instance, if you go to AWS, you will figure out like how many services are available right there. So, and if you are new to the cloud or moving your first moving for the first time to cloud, you will figure out like there's not just one family of services. There's quite tons of different families of services available in the cloud, which you can pick from to design your overall architecture. And of course, this demands a new skill set. And so today, I'm going to talk about few set of skills that you need to master, especially when you move into the cloud development and adapting cloud as a software architect. And so let's look into these skills. So the first skill I'm going to talk about today is on distributed systems. And probably you might know, if we look at a solution that we deploy in the cloud, we will directly, nominally or unknowingly, will depend on kind of a distributed system in the cloud. For example, if let's say you are developing an application and want to set up the correct security levels in the cloud, probably you have to look at how you could design the networks. For example, in AWS, how to design the VPC, subnets, routing tables, security groups, NACLs. That is quite straightforward if you know the underneath or the basics of networking. And also, if you're coming from kind of building software application, more like let's say building monolith application, you might figure out like when you go to the cloud, you might get a lot of options to kind of even lift and shift these applications, also to modernize these with, for example, microservices. And this comes with a lot of need to know what are the options available and so on. For example, let's say if you are you could easily leverage the cloud to do some heavy lifting if you are following the microservices architecture paradigm. For example, let's say you have multiple services in cloud, microservices in cloud, and you want to synchronize the data. You could select some of the managed services like SQS, SNS, manage queues, or manage pub/sub tools like SNS to do the coordination and communication between these services. And but it's not the technology that drives you for this. It's mostly the nature of the distributed systems, understanding of the distributed systems, where you can go and pick the technology as a consequence. So this is one thing really important for any of the software architects who move into cloud, to understand the fundamentals of distributed systems. Then the cloud technology and architecture expertise. And you might think knowing the technology and the tools in cloud or the services in cloud is enough. That's not the truth, because for example, if you don't have the expertise on using some of these services, at least some types of these services, you might not have that experience in understanding how to put these services into your architecture. For instance, at least if you have some expertise on, let's say, at least from in AWS, if you have expertise on virtual machines or with EC2, or using, let's say, ECS for containers, then you can adapt to maybe later on for Kubernetes. That's quite easy. But without knowing that, if you look at the cloud, you might lose some of the details which might be relevant in terms of your architecture. So having maybe starting from the 10,000 feet view, knowing the broader kind of the structure of the cloud, and then gradually go inside, will really help you to understand the cloud overall, and then having some of the expertise in terms of trying out these different types of services will build your mental model, so that you can start designing properly in the cloud. And also, if you refer the latest developments, you can find a lot of material out there. For example, for any architect, referring the well-architected framework is a must. And if you clearly go through these pillars, you will find out like these are none other than the quality attributes I just discussed in my very first slide, where these are also part of your application design. But of course, you have to start thinking about from your application perspective, and then move into these quality attributes of the cloud and the infrastructure later on. Then this is another skill that most of us doesn't care much, but is really important. Now we were talking about cloud native development, and also services that's quite embedded with cloud and the day-to-day development. And sometimes our developers might work on our local environment, and sometimes we might, if the application is cloud native, they might either go for a hybrid development, like they have some part of the application working in their machine and the other part is running in the cloud. So in either of these cases, it's important to keep in mind that developers need to iterate in terms of their development, and if we have a longer iteration time, that will directly affect their productivity. So when selecting these services in cloud, either selecting serverless or Lambda, or even like going for different architectures, fine, still you have to see how practical it is to have a better development experience, so that developers can be very much productive and could iterate faster in terms of adding more functionality. And also, like another area is that from the developers perspective, some of these when we design the architecture, some of the solutions that we pick, so some of the services that we pick might be quite new to them, where it could also impact their the productivity adversely. So we have to plan also in terms of this, because like if you look at last few years, the AWS cloud has evolved massively, and in a particular component in the cloud, let's say in your architecture, in the cloud architecture that you picked 2-3 years ago, might not be relevant today, because there's an alternative approach that can solve that problem. So for developers, this might be a challenge, like adapting to all of these new things. So it's important that you have a properly planned in terms of with the right abstractions, or even using emulators, how to keep the developer productivity high, allowing them to iterate faster. And another area in terms of the cloud is the cost-centric design. So the cost always comes as a quality attributes in terms of the architecture. But if you look at really in terms of the cloud, now we have a lot of options available. For example, which storage that we are going to choose. There's 5 to 10 services available in AWS. And if we go to, let's say, what kind of compute that we are going to choose, so many are there. and even very high level services like AWS Cognito, even uh, services for search, all these are available. But what should we pick? I mean, should it be cloud native ones, or should it be more of like we write the code and then manage? It all depends on the cost of ownership. And when I say the cost of ownership, I am actually meaning not just the cost of the cloud consumption, but also the effort that we need to put to adapt these services or adapt these solutions into our overall architecture. And for instance, if you look at, let's say, if you are developing a web application and you want to have a authentication and authorization mechanism for your application, you might very well select AWS Cognito. And because the cost is quite less in terms of the upfront cost, you could start with it, and then maybe gradually later, when the application grows, still you can use it because the cost is quite low in terms of the per user pricing. But if you are looking at, let's say, a storage solution like DynamoDB versus RDS, you really have to look at your data architecture and the data access patterns, because it might impact the overall cost ultimately. So realizing this concentric design is quite important so that you can define your overall architecture in a better manner. Then finally, I think this is one of the most important things or important skill for a solution architect to know, which is the DevOps skill set, which is like we can't really differentiate between the DevOps and the code. I mean, the name itself means Dev and the Ops. And we know, like in the modern times, we have a separate person also who's responsible in terms of DevOps in most of our teams. But as an architect, it's also important to understand that DevOps is not something separate. It's a part of the development as well as the architecture. So if you choose the solution that is more like that has the capacity to develop as well as operate in terms of quick releases, that will really help the product to go to market fast, and also to do the change management properly. And also, today we are not talking about the infrastructure and the code separately, as I mentioned before. And even going further, you can find the DevOps frameworks like CDK or even Pulumi, where we can write our code alongside the infrastructure, so that ultimately they will blend with each other, and we can do the releases together. So any change to the infrastructure or the application could be released even together. So that's kind of a huge milestone if you look back the last 10 years, where the cloud started from starting from the infrastructure. Now we are talking about infrastructure and the code together as a platform. And also, I mean, DevOps is not just one skill, like one type, like it's not just about the CI/CD. It's also about the practices and the processes that a team will follow in terms of their day-to-day processes. And as an architect, the architect also needs to look at how we can optimize these processes in a way that it will impact the overall ROI of the product. So that's basically the skills that I want to cover. And there are a few key takeaways as well in terms of the architecture. So one thing I just covered is that the role of the architect is actually changing with the involvement with cloud, and it's been evolving, and there's no clear stop. I mean, when we look back in year 2021, we can see we need this skill set that for cloud architect, they need to have this skill set to design better applications in cloud. And also these skills are changing. So you might maybe later on with a new paradigm shift, maybe we don't know, like some few years back, serverless and cloud native became quite popular, so which demands certain set of skills. And maybe later on there could be completely new set of skills. And it's good to have kind of adaptive mindset where you can be kind of ready for these changes. And also, if you clearly see, the cloud and the technologies are quite evolving, but the process that we need to follow as architect isn't changed that much, because I see this misconception in the industry where like people start with the technology first. For example, when a team is doing a new, let's say a team is doing an e-commerce application, some teams might even, like some developers might even think starting with the technology. Hey, let's go with serverless, use API gateway, Lambda, and then develop the application. But that's not the right way. We have to still follow the same process where we start with the the functional and non-functional requirements and identifying the significant one for the architecture, which we call the quality attributes, and then gradually move into identifying the trade-offs, finding the right technology at last, not at the first. So still, though the cloud evolves, the architecture process that we used to follow could be still the same, like without much of a change. But of course, having a broader understanding on the cloud will definitely help to maximize the usage. And it's quite important, as I mentioned before, not to have the technology or cloud service biasness upfront, where we have to keep it for the latter. So that's basically it from my side. So I want to open the session for the questions.
Thank you, Ashan, for the wonderful insight. Actually, we have a couple of questions from our community. And the first one, I will say, do you recommend using managed service or set up service your own way?
Okay, so this is kind of one of the areas that I covered, whether to use kind of serverless or cloud native services, or I guess the question is about whether to use cloud native services or we develop our own service. And this is basically what I want to iterate is you have to start from the functional and non-functional requirements. Maybe your application might have a compliance reason to keep the maybe to run the application on-prem. Or it could be that it's totally fine to go on cloud purely and then deploy it into multiple regions. That works perfectly. So you have to look from your compliance side, also from the governance, from the core requirements of the product that you're going to develop, and then decide on the strategy, whether to go cloud native or manage your own thing. And definitely going cloud native has its own perks. So if the possibility is there, I will definitely go for that. But it's always a discussion, like to understand the accounts first.
Okay, thank you. And I will move on to next question. Tell us something about AWS well-architected framework.
Okay, so about this AWS well-architected framework, I have a lot of memories because I was there in the reInvent event where it was introduced back in, I guess, 2014 or 15. And the importance is, like, when we look at the cloud, we need to have a proper process of identifying or how we define the architecture in cloud. So the well-architected framework is kind of a good blueprint where you could start with a certain set of questions, certain set of processes where it will guide you through how you can ensure these pillars in terms of security, reliability, even how you operate. So that's kind of I would say the handbook for any architect to start with AWS or even with any public cloud provider.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ashan. I will move on to next question. What is your recommendation on revisiting the architectures? How often you do it for your projects?
Okay, so when it comes to architecture, like the architecture is kind of the hardest part or highest cost of change. We will rarely change in terms of the architecture. So we try to design the architecture runaway, like at least to foresee for the foreseeable future. Of course, we don't want to do the big design upfront to predict everything and then do everything right now. So that's kind of a no-go. But still, we have to have a somewhat clear picture where you are going to go ahead with. So the architecture doesn't change that much, but still we have to understand whether the architecture is drifting or not. So looking at the drift, we can plan. It could be like this review. Of course, we can have a frequent review of whether the things are changing in maybe the technology, even in the cloud landscape, whether we can optimize the infrastructure or optimize the architecture. But this doesn't happen overnight. It should be very well planned activity.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ashan. Actually, we have one more question, and we would like to know about the AWS community activities in Colombo.
AWS community activities
activities in your place.
Okay, so shall I talk about in Sri Lanka?
Yes, that's where we need to know.
So I think in Sri Lanka, there's as a country, there's a lot of activities going on.
Yeah.
So one thing clearly I see is the AWS User Group that's happening quite active in Colombo. Unfortunately, last 1 or 2 years due to the pandemic, it's being online. But we had been having it physically for quite some time before, and also. Apart from that, there's a lot of other user groups and activities going on, which handled by different communities in the country. So it's good to get involved if anyone is interested. And
Yeah,
you
it's
can
a glad.
also contact any of the AWS core team members for that.
Yeah, it's glad to hear that, Ashan. Okay, thank you very much, Ashan. That was very informative, and thank you for your insights.
Okay, thanks a lot for providing this opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again.
Build. Go. Build. Build. Go. Build. Go build. Go build. There is no compression algorithm for experience. Def and test are the most important workloads. Dance like nobody's watching. 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 Encrypt like everyone is.